LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we present part 1 of our interview with Courtney Brown, who discusses the results of a remote viewing project which focused on the events of 9/11. Listeners unfamiliar with remote viewing may wish to check out a previous show with Courtney, which is entitled Remote Viewing, Consciousness and Reality, which you can of course find at the LegalizeFreedom.com website. The 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York and Washington DC in the year 2001 were arguably the most shocking and audacious events to happen so far this century, and there are many unexplained anomalies associated with these attacks. The number and nature of the anomalies have led a significant and growing number of people to question the official explanation of these events as simply the actions of a small band of terrorists known as al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. This investigation takes a fresh look at 9/11 using remote viewing methods that were originally developed by the US military and used for espionage purposes. The results are both deeply disturbing and highly controversial. Hello and welcome, Courtney, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Hey Greg, it's my great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Courtney, today we're going to be talking about the latest remote viewing project where you've been dealing with the events of 9/11. No one needs to be told what that's all about. Before we dive into it, just for people who are new to this, tell us a bit about yourself, the Farsight Institute, and just a little, in a nutshell, about remote viewing, because there may be some listeners who've got no idea what it is.
Sure. Well, remote viewing, let's start with the remote viewing part. It's a mental procedure for transferring information across time and space. And, some of the viewers who know nothing about it might say, well, why don't we just call that psychic? So it's related. But when we talk about remote viewing, we're referring to people who are highly trained and use the methodologies that were developed by the United States military and used for espionage purposes. The official program for remote viewing was closed down in November of 1995 when it became public, but everyone I know who I respect assumes, and with some knowledge, that they immediately opened up a brand new project, and it's much bigger and better today. So the transferring of information, perceptual information, images, all the hearing, touch, sight, taste, smell, 5 senses across time and space. So it's from the military perspective, it's very useful for a means of espionage. However, the Farsight Institute, that's F-A-R-S-I-G-H-T, like seeing far, is the leading venue for public civilian scientific investigation of the remote viewing phenomenon. And we feature remote viewing studies, a huge number of them, over a great many years, that use the military or military-derived procedures. And we're the only major venue that exists planet-wide for these type of major public studies that people can just go to our website for and watch them. And the website, of course, is www.farsight, F-A-R-S-I-G-H-T, like seeing far.org, O-R-G, because we're a nonprofit. I am a professor, a college professor at a major university. However, I do not do any remote viewing research there at the university. I teach mathematics courses in a social science program, applied mathematics, and my specialty is nonlinear deterministic applications to mathematics, such as fractals, chaos, catastrophe theory, things like that. But outside of the university, at the Farsight Institute, is where I do these remote viewing studies, and I'm usually the chief investigator for many of the projects at the Institute, and the people we have working as viewers are the best in the world. So in terms of the use of these military procedures. So these are really great. these are really great, and these people have trained for years, and they can do things that other people consider magical, that other people consider scary good, but that's just if you're not familiar with this stuff. If you're familiar with this stuff and you understand what's going on, it's just, we understand the phenomenon pretty well now. The science of remote viewing, actually how it can be done, because it seems to be, well, it is in violation of the two paradigms of physics, which is quantum mechanics and relativistic physics. But that's because the fundamentals of quantum mechanics and relativistic physics have not changed for nearly 100 years, actually over 100 years. So they're very dated. Now, there's been lots of advances in the application and details of those things, but the fundamentals haven't been modified for 100 years plus. So really, we're talking about very outdated physics that's in need of a severe overhaul. And it's because we're beginning to understand the nature of a greater reality, the need of a physics that incorporates all phenomenon rather than just a small subset of phenomena, that we can understand how the remote viewing subject works. And I have actually spoken at universities, major universities around the world, and about the science of remote viewing. And there's a generational lag before physicists who are still very resistant to these ideas because they grew up in the old days die or retire and are replaced by younger people who are more open to the wider range of phenomena and going to modify the theories to fit the facts. So anyway, that's it in a nutshell.
Well, I think that there's a saying, isn't there, that science progresses one funeral at a time. And
yeah, that actually Max Planck was the one who made that great observation in recent time, which is major advances in science occur not because someone thinks of a great new idea and everyone accepts it. What happens is you get people retiring and dying off, and then they're replaced by people who were introduced to these ideas earlier in their career, such as when they were graduate students, and then when they became old enough to sort of dominate the intellectual market, because they're in their 40s or 50s, then those ideas became sort of stable in the intellectual infrastructure of the sort of academy. But yeah, one funeral at a time is what it takes. And however, things are changing. Back in 1957, when Hugh Everett first introduced the idea of the other worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the basis for understanding how remote viewing actually works, he was tremendously ridiculed and left physics, academic physics, as a result, and went into the Defense Department and did work on the nuclear energy program. But now 18% of mainstream physicists in universities fully accept his view as being the correct one. Now that still means 82% are stuck in the old days with the Copenhagen interpretation or the standard model, which merges that with the relativistic view. But those people are older and they are retiring and dying off. Slowly but surely they will go. And that 18% will grow into 50% and then 80%. And that's how it will work.
Well, it does seem that humanity goes through cycles that veer between extreme materialism and almost complete sort of non-materialism, I suppose, in complete sort of spiritual life. And that there have been periods in time, a very long time ago, when the human race was, a materialistic basis. And I think in the 20th century, I would say we're at some sort of nadir in terms of our relationship with non-material forces. And as you say, that is changing now. So we mightn't see it in our lifetimes, but there will be more of a harmonic convergence between science and spirituality, I think, in the future.
Actually, I think we're heading towards a sort of an intellectual crisis pretty soon, which is a good thing, because I think some of these issues sometimes issues raise themselves quickly because they can't be avoided, and it causes an intellectual crisis with the people who haven't yet died off and retired or died off. And so when that happens, it's fun. And what you get is a situation where the intellectual struggles between the old view and the new view actually battle themselves out. and then the old view actually fails, it actually collapses. And so that is very rare to happen, but normally it's generational replacement that works. But when it does happen, it's a lot of fun to watch.
I've found the best way to go through life, really, in terms of understanding what it's all about, is to keep open-minded, don't take things personally, and don't become attached to a worldview such that if it's proven to be completely wrong, that you can't let it go. And even scientists are like the rest of us, they're human, and they have emotions and egos. And they'll get attached to their worldview idea, and then gets tipped on its head, and they won't let it go because they've identified with it. They think that they'll lose some part of themselves if they acknowledge that things are different.
Yeah, no, that's actually correct. In fact, some physicists like Lee Smolin and so on, they've observed that in the realm of physics, for example, it's almost impossible to get an academic job in a major university unless you're a believer in string theory. Now, there are competing theories to string theory, and string theory really hasn't come up with a provable, testable hypothesis and finding. I mean, it's really theory. At some point, you'd really say, is this just poetry or is this for real? But they're dominant in the physics discipline. And the real question people are trying to face now is whether we have a whole generation of physicists who have wasted their entire academic life, a whole generation, pursuing something that just isn't correct. So that's and string theory is a huge investment. I mean, it's very complicated mathematically. I am a mathematician, and string theory is at the high end of complexity. And that's really the question people are really sort of facing. The whole building of the Hadron Collider was a desperate attempt to come up with some prediction, to actually have some prediction coming out of string theory that matches some type of empirical result. I mean, that's how desperate they were. They had nothing up until then. And now it's still in debate whether they've got the Holy Grail or anything, but that's the nature of academy. So it's literally people can't get jobs unless they are believers in the doctrine. But anyway, that's the nature of humanity, and whether they believe or not, time keeps moving forward and they die and are replaced.
Well, this cognitive dissonance, which it's a form of, is something that certainly is deep around the events of 9/11.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have, there's the official story, and then there's 1,000 other variations, little tweaks here and there of how things went down in people's minds. And but when it comes to, again, everyone listening to this will know how much controversy there's been there. Anybody questioning the official narrative has been shot down. And even though there's been some great work done there, not least by organizations like Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, still it's a bit like the same with the JFK assassination there. The official narrative's there, it stands, and it's been questioned, it's been debunked left, right, and center. But in terms of our collective consciousness, we all go along, the mainstream. It's decided that we know what happened on that day. And yes, there's all these other alternative theories, but they sort of don't exist in a way. So we're kind of collectively fooling ourselves in not looking at this. And no doubt when people come and look at what you guys have been doing, remote viewing the events of 9/11, there's going to be the same feelings will come up for some people if the information you present goes against what they believe.
Well, what we have here is a new element in the discussion, because up until the current time, all you've had, and this is important what they've had, but what they've had is basically forensic evidence and logical argumentation suggesting that the official story is incorrect. So the official story is that some minimally trained Islamic crazy hijackers crashed these planes into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon, and thus we went off to war. So that's the official story. But there are so many anomalies and crazy things associated with that, and so much looks like something was done behind the scenes, and so much of the story just seems to have been fabricated, that there's this cottage industry of truthers, as they like to call themselves, 9/11 truthers, that are bringing up all of these anomalies and arguing that there must have been a alternative thing. For example, the big ones are the collapse of the buildings. The Building 7, which is the third building and the original building of the World Trade Center, when that collapsed, and it's visible in the YouTube videos all over the place, you know, it really did look like a controlled demolition. It collapsed suddenly, all at once, exactly the way a controlled demolition is done. And at no point in the past ever has a modern architectural building collapsed as a result of an internal fire, which is what the official story is, an office furniture fire. So the official story seems impossible. And when you look at it, it looks like, you know, when you look at the video, it says, the engineers who have looked at the video and the group of architects and engineers, I mean, they clearly say that's what we do. That's a controlled demolition, exactly. And you see you hear and see the explosion at the base of the building and the whole thing. And then with the World Trade Center towers, the Twin Towers, they collapsed all by themselves on their own footprint. They didn't fall over or anything. They came straight down, which is exactly what happens with the controlled demolition. And when they got to the bottom, they were essentially vaporized. There was no wreckage. I mean, if it was a diesel fuel, actually a jet fuel, an office furniture fire that brought them down, you should see the whole building should be down there. But there was the rubble that was down there was extremely minimal. The buildings were essentially vaporized. And so the real question is, how did they come down? And so no one's contesting that something didn't crash into no one's contesting that something crashed into the Twin Towers. I mean, there were clearly crashes, but did those things bring down the building? So that's what the whole thing is. Now, when we started our project, I realized that this would be a new element in the whole debate, because it would be, with these remote viewers, which are the best on the planet, we would be able to bring in new eyewitness reports. And these eyewitness reports would be different from the original eyewitness reports, because these eyewitness reports were remote viewing eyewitness reports done under totally blind, squeaky clean scientific conditions, meaning the viewers are never told anything about what they're supposed to be perceiving. They get a non-leading email from me saying, we have a new project, there's a target, send me the session, period, end of story, that's it. And they go and they do their stuff, and they send me the sessions. And now, with this project, we decided to make this a video remote viewing project. So the sessions were recorded live on video with no one in the room except the remote viewers. They set up their own cameras, and they recorded their sessions and sent them to me, and then I assembled them and so on into the documentaries that are now been released. And so they had no communication between themselves. Daz Smith is one of them, and he's British. He lives in Bath. And Dick Algeier is from Hawaii. They had no interactions between themselves during the time when the project was underway. And neither one had any information at all about the nature of the project. In fact, they had been told for years, while we were doing other projects, that we would never do the 9/11 project. And so they were totally convinced that when they did their sessions that, Courtney had always said, on radio, in fact, I may have even mentioned this on your show, that we would never touch that project. And so I did that on purpose because these viewers are so good that once they start their sessions, they're going to see the collapsing Twin Towers. I didn't want them to think, oh, this is the Twin Towers, because they have to do their work blind. So I sort of prepped it for a long time, saying that's never going to happen, and saying it on radio too, for the record, essentially lying, but I had to do that in order to get the project done. I had to convince everybody that would be a project we would never do, because when we do it, I got to tell you, these viewers are so good, they would have figured it out within the first session, and then the project would have ended. And so we never would have found out what the real stuff was. So they had to be kept in doubt. I mean, serious, serious doubt during the entire data collection process. Now, when it was all over after a few months of remote viewing, I told them the day that they would be told the target, and all the remote viewing sessions had been done and submitted. and they were going to get the revelation of what the target was while they were having a face-to-face meeting over GoToMeeting, which is sort of like Skype. And they were face-to-face, and they opened up an email from me telling them what the target is. Previous to that, Dick Allgaier was not able to sleep for 36 hours. Daz Smith and Dick were both sweating on their brow. They were totally convinced they screwed up totally, and this was going to be one of the most embarrassing things that ever happened, because they had all sorts of data that matched 9/11, and they knew that that could not be the project. So, because of all the things I had said, so they were sweating it out. And then when they saw it, they saw the actual target, the level of relief that came out of their face, it was almost comical, because they realized that their stuff wasn't so bad after all. Anyway, so what we have now is new eyewitness reports, and these remote viewing eyewitness reports, conducted under the best of situations, are different from physical eyewitnesses, because physical eyewitnesses, you just see what you see. Remote viewing eyewitnesses can go in and out of the buildings, they can go to people that are involved far away, they can connect all sorts of things, and given that these are the best remote viewers on the planet, then we are really in an optimal situation for sort of finding out what happened. Now, I have to give a full confession at this point, if you don't mind. And that is, when I started this project, I did not believe the conspiracy theorists. And I was looking actually for a project, because we had done so many projects that had so many sort of amazing results, sort of out there results, that I said, we really need a conservative project here. And I was expecting, I watched the 9/11 events on TV just like everybody else. I believed the government story. So I said, I want a project that will just sort of back up the government story. I mean, back up, what we know already, and it'll be a conservative type of project, but it'll demonstrate the value of remote viewing for stuff like this. So I wasn't expecting all of this. And then the results came in, and they totally contradicted the government story. I mean, like 100% opposite, and backed up a lot of the stuff that was coming out of the conspiracy theory realm, out of the architects and engineers stuff. And I had to have a moment when I just simply looked at myself in the mirror, and I had to face it, and I said, look, I have to give up all assumptions about this and just take the data where they are. What does it actually show? And it clearly shows these remote viewing data, and I have to believe it because these are the best remote viewers on the planet, and I designed the study. And this is clearly a situation where we have the absolute best of data, totally unambiguous, clear as day, showing that this was an inside job from start to finish, from top to bottom. And there may have been, I'm not saying that there weren't Islamic terrorists on those planes, on some or all of the planes, but they were incredibly small bit players, and they were not what was causing those events. They were there perhaps, but that was not, and I say perhaps because in situations, now that I have the full data on what actually happened, I've looked at a lot of the conspiracy theories type stuff as well, and a lot of the things have come out that are very clear. Like, for example, in the video coverage inside the airport, there's no video coverage inside the airport of the Islamic terrorists actually walking through the airport and getting onto the airplane. So, who really knows what really happened in Washington, D.C., for example, with regard to the Pentagon thing? The Pentagon thing, for example, it turned out we don't know what happened to the American Airlines 77, but that's, according to these data, that's not what hit the Pentagon. What hit the Pentagon was a missile. It was a cruise missile. And then if you look at the actual physical data, which I sort of didn't know about when the study happened, but now I know about it, the remote viewing data perfectly match up the physical data. For example, in the physical data, the object that hit the Pentagon was flying over treetop level, like 300 or 400 feet up. And just before it approached the Pentagon grounds, it went over some trees and wires, and then immediately dropped down to just a few feet, like 4 or 5 feet over the ground, and then flew horizontal over the grounds of the Pentagon and smacked horizontally into the wall of the Pentagon. Well, I'm a pilot, and I've since investigated a bunch of pilot groups that are publishing on this stuff. And they said, I know myself I couldn't do such a stunt. And the pilots, these are major pilots, airline pilots and things like that, they said, A, it's impossible for an airliner, even with a Top Gun pilot, to do that. You can't get a big jet like that to do that kind of a stunt. And B, no minimally trained Islamic terrorist goofball is going to be able to pull that off no matter what. I mean, our best pilots in a fighter jet would have trouble doing that, but you're not going to be able, but could maybe do that in a fighter jet, but you certainly can't do it with an airliner. And a goofball Islamic terrorist with just a little bit of training absolutely can't pull off something like that, even if the plane could do it, and the plane can't do it. So, I have to, and being a pilot myself, I have to say, I have to admit, what actually happens with regard to the radar data and stuff like that does look impossible. And then the hole in the Pentagon, for example, is too small for an airliner, and there are no wings in the wreckage, and there's no marks on the side of the walls of the Pentagon where there are wings. Whatever hit the Pentagon didn't have wings. So, and there's no wings in the wreckage. So, there's a ton of contradictory data with respect to that. What if you look at the Pentagon evidence, it matches perfectly a cruise missile. It doesn't match an airliner at all. So anyway, with the World Trade Center, the same stuff. Now the thing is, why your viewers, why your listeners should want to watch the documentary. This thing actually came out in two parts because it was getting close to 4 hours. And it has two parts. The first part deals with the World Trade Center attacks, and the second part deals with the Pentagon attack and the organization that orchestrated both the New York and Washington, D.C. attacks. So we figured out not only what happened to the World Trade Center and the Pentagon stuff, but we actually found out the whole story of the internal organization of the people who were orchestrating it. And it's absolutely fascinating. I have actually spoken to a large number of people who have watched both parts with nearly 4 hours, and I have yet to find somebody who was bored, even for a minute, in it. I've heard tons of stories where people tired at the middle of the night saying, "Okay, I'll watch the first one, and I see if I won't get too exhausted, I'll try to watch the second one afterward." And almost invariably, I hear them say, after the first one, they couldn't stop. They just kept on going through the night till they saw the second one because it was so fascinating. So you actually see the remote viewers do their sessions live, and since these are such good people, they come out with all this detail, one after the next. These are not like vague, fuzzy stuff. They're explaining exactly what happened, and when you realize it happened under totally blind conditions, your jaw drops. And you get to also see how the remote viewing actually works. So people have heard me talk about remote viewing a lot, but when you actually see it, unedited sessions under, coming up with this unbelievably spellbinding revelations, you realize, oh my gosh, so this is what people have been talking about. So if anyone who's skeptical about remote viewing, this is the investment you should make in time to watch these things. Anyway, people can connect to the videos at farsight.org, www.farsight.org, farsight.org. Right now, they're available as downloads from Vimeo. They have video on demand. And we are working on on DVDs to come out with it as well. They're not ready yet. And the reason is that our manufacturer of DVDs, which is CreateSpace through Amazon, they're changing their manufacturing process, their uploading process. On October 1st, they're switching from one way of getting their material to the next, and we're right in the middle of that, so we don't want to send them our material until after October 1st. So sometime, hopefully in October, it will be available as a DVD also for people who want that format.
I think that what you alluded to a moment ago, you have to keep reminding yourself when you're looking at these sessions that these guys don't know what it is that they're working on. Obviously, that's the whole point. They don't know what the target is, but it's very easy to slip into kind of like, well, this is so detailed and fits with a lot of the more credible alternative theories that they sort of they must have some kind of knowledge, but you have to keep pinching yourself, saying, no,
Yeah.
they don't know what they're looking at. They're just looking and reporting and recording what's coming through. And of course, it's not just visual impressions, is it? You can get other sensory information.
Yeah, they're accessing everything, including the thoughts that people are having. So, yeah, you're raising a good point. The level of detail and the coherency of the descriptions of what's going on is so high, you really do have to pinch yourself to say, they're doing this totally blind without any, and they both came in with exactly the same data. And they're separated with a world apart, no communication between them. It really, you have to pinch yourself to realize they don't know anything about this target at all. So, it's really mind-blowing. When they actually get to the internal organization in part 2 of the documentary, that's really fascinating, because there's good pictures of people involved, good sketches, there's a color photo of one of the guys in charge of the whole thing. Not a photo, but a good color drawing, painting actually. And it's the level of detail describing how the World Trade Centers were laced with explosives, how the people did it, the numbers of people did it, how they did it, what time of day, what time of night, how they came in vans, they were wearing jumpsuits, how the whole World Trade Center was sort of laced up with explosives, the detonations that were being used, the type of material. There's some indication that some of the material was atomic in nature for the detonations, which would help to explain why there was no real wreckage for the World Trade Center. That when those buildings collapsed, there wasn't much left of them. I mean, if you look at the pictures right after the collapse, you have this huge buildings. I mean, huge buildings, and there's almost no rubble. And so when you realize, when the remote viewers describe this, they describe how the buildings were essentially vaporized by the explosives, and that actually matches what you see, which is really fascinating. Now, by the way, for those people who are wondering how could atomic stuff be used, well, we're not pinning ourselves down with regard to any one type of explosive, but there are different types of atomic explosives that are very small and that do not produce a lot of radiation. But some of the remote viewing data did say that there was a residual level of radiation, and it could have been easily picked up by Geiger counters at the site. But these small, very, very, very small nukes do exist that could be used for building demolition, and they're not like the early ones that were covered with a uranium shell that left a tremendous amount of radiation. They have versions now that are not radiation free, but close to it. So they produce an internal explosion, but they don't have the dirty radiation shell around the outside that really causes a lot of the mess happen to us. And they're extremely small. Then you have to say that when the first hydrogen bomb went off, for example, well, how did they detonate it? Well, they detonated it with a mini atomic bomb. So these mini atomic bombs have been around for a long time. The clean versions of them are relatively, 20 years, but relatively new phenomenon. But anyway, it was clear that some of the explosives that were used were of varying nature, because they were sort of packed or wrapped around a lot of the support columns in the World Trade Center. So that's sort of, not everything. If there was atomic elements in it, not everything was atomic. Now, this type of stuff has been around. This type of sort of theorizing has been around for a long time. For example, on YouTube, you can see a video that is hosted by Ed Asner, the famous actor and former president of the Screen Actors Guild, job once held by Ronald Reagan, where he introduces a lot of the people from architects and engineers, where they're talking about, and also firemen and police people who describe what was there at the base, saying, this is just crazy stuff. And the architects and engineers are absolutely unambiguous about it, that this was a controlled demolition. And with respect to what was at the base after the building, especially Building 7 came down, there was lots of liquid metal, liquid steel. And some of the rescue people describe it like a foundry, like literally streams of liquid metal. And that's impossible with jet fuel. You can't melt steel, especially when it's encased in concrete, and even without being encased in concrete, jet fuel can't do that. But some of these explosives can and are necessary for bringing down buildings. Now, there's also another thing, and when you think about a motive, you have to remember that the World Trade Centers were bombed. The North Tower was bombed in February of 1993 by an Islamic terrorist putting stuff in a van, and it blew out 5 floors and structurally damaged the building. Now, the goal was to have the building fall over and crash into the South Tower. However, it didn't happen, but nonetheless, the building was structurally damaged. And probably it was recognized at that time, probably, that the building did need to come down. Unfortunately, the entire World Trade Centers, Building 7, as well as the Twin Towers, were absolutely packed with asbestos. I mean, they were built in the day where asbestos was sprayed everywhere as a fire retardant for those buildings. It was all over the place. So there's no way you could take down those buildings. You just can't knock them down piece by piece. It's a billion-dollar job. I mean, it's huge. I mean, the trouble with those big buildings is once they're up forever because you can't get them down. Now you have a structurally unsound building, and all 3 buildings are filled with asbestos. How are you going to get rid of them? So I think, I'm speculating now outside of the data, but I think what probably happened was people said, well, look, the buildings have to come down anyway. We might as well get some value out of this. And so they allowed a half-witted Islamic terrorist plot to proceed and then filled in the blanks to make sure everything worked with appropriate materials and so on to bring down the building. So you essentially got a controlled demolition with a public facade of an Islamic terrorist attack. And then you got not only the destruction of the buildings for free, because you didn't have to pay to have them taken down piece by piece, and you also avoid all the lawsuits about asbestosis from people who were both working in the buildings, eventually suffering because asbestos could have by that time started to fragment and get into the air circulation system, but also from the people that would have suffered from asbestosis due to the collapse. So you don't have any of that legal trouble. And the insurance companies pay for the entire removal. And then you also get a war that was probably felt to be necessary to get rid of Saddam Hussein to finish the first Gulf War. I'm just speculating, but I'm thinking that's probably what the logic was behind all of this. And now you have the internal story with this new documentary of what actually happened, and it's so fascinating to watch it. And it's our very best remote viewing project ever done. We've done some really great ones, but this one is very timely and keeps you on the edge of your seat. It's hard to imagine something 4 hours long keeping you on the edge of your seat, but this is better than Gone with the Wind. I mean, I have not heard of a single. You saw them yourselves, Greg. I mean, were you bored by it?
No, not at all. I watched the whole thing in one stretch, actually.
Yeah, I mean, and it's hard to watch something that long if it's not riveting. I mean, if it's boring in the slightest, it's 4 hours is too much. I have not heard of a single person saying that they had trouble keeping their eyes open. I mean, it's like they're glued to it and saying, oh my gosh, look at that. Especially when they see the detail that's coming out with these sessions and all the answers sort of coming out and how it all matches in with the physical data afterwards. It's fascinating. Anyway, so this is the project of the century. And if you go to farsight.org, Farsight, we have a very great trailer that's 6 minutes long that sort of summarizes a lot of the main stuff and gives you an idea of what you're going to get. And this is a big one. This is a really big one.
Well, 3 points just popping up in my head from what you've just been saying. There's a building in the city centre here where I live, and it's only about 5-6 stories, something like that. They can't. It's coming down, but they can't blow it up because it's tightly surrounded by lots of very old buildings of historic interest and private homes and what have you. It's an office building, so there's no way they can do it that way. So they're having to demolish it sort of by hand.
Yeah.
So they start at the top and they just take the roof off, and well, they probably don't do that at the start until they get the rain in. And they're just working down, gradually taking the building down, just like you would a Lego building or something. And it's not a very big building, and they've been there for months and months. And there's still, all the floors are still intact. It's taking them so long to take that thing apart by hand, basically.
That's exactly right. And when you talk about taking down the Twin Towers, you just throw up your hands. And now, mind you, you have a structurally damaged building in the first place, the North Tower, because of the first attack in February of 1993. So, it's only a matter of time before more cracks, becomes a serious liability. Somehow those things had to come down. So no one really thought about taking them down when they put them up. But these huge buildings are a real liability when you realize that they get old and eventually need to come down. And this probably was thought to be a convenient way to get rid of them.
Well, you had Silverstein, did he double his insurance on the buildings before, in the run-up to 9/11?
Yeah, there was a lot of circumstantial things that were sort of questioning. I mean, the buildings were purchased recently before the attacks, like a year or two before the attacks. I think a year before the attack. I'm not sure on that. And then, meaning they were owned by somebody else, like some type of authority. And then the single owner bought them, and like within a year they were destroyed, and insurance was purchased beforehand. Anyway, the insurance covered the whole thing. Plus, I understand. I mean, it was insurance, shoved out a lot of money. My understanding is that the owners actually made a ton from that. But I'm not saying that they did it on. I'm not accusing. I don't want to get into a liability situation. I'm not saying that it was done purposefully or that they knew anything about it. All I'm saying is that you're correct to note that some things happened that were either circumstantial or highly fortuitous from the perspective of the owners of the building.
Yeah, there's a lot of little bits and pieces when you look out there that indicate sort of foreknowledge, or certainly a suggestion of it, as you say, if you don't want to get into a liability situation. A couple of the other things I was thinking is there was also, after 9/11, several years after, I think it was in Spain, there was a tower block that caught fire, and it was gutted, it was destroyed, but at no point did it ever look like it was going to fall down. And in fact, the fire eventually burnt itself out, didn't it?
Yeah, they've never, ever had a fire take down a modern architecture building anywhere. So if that happened with the World Trade Center, that's the very first. And those were really well-constructed buildings. And also, there's other really sort of crazy things that happen, like why did they fall on their own footprint? Exactly. So, and then also, why did the lower floors collapse? Let us say that you believe that the jets actually crashed, that the jets actually caused the collapse of the top floors. Well, why did the lower floors attack? Like, let's say those buildings were over 100 floors tall. So let's say you get down to floor number 20. I'm picking that out randomly. Well, the floors 1 through 20 were strong enough to hold 80 plus floors above them. I mean, they were like, they were better than Hercules. I mean, they were strong. So when all of the upper floors were already gone, why did the lower floors continue to collapse? There was no weight on them. So they should have stood like the Rock of Gibraltar forever. But the building collapsed all the way down to the last floor. How in the world did the first floor collapse? There was nothing above it. I mean, the whole stuff is really crazy. Now, the remote viewing data clearly tell you why it collapsed. You see the guys going in with the vans. You see them putting the explosives around all the floors. You see that. You see the whole thing. Now, the jets is very interesting. There's one of the data that come in is one of the sessions that came in was very fascinating. Indicated that at least with one of the jets, the original pilots, were still sitting in the cockpit. And what happens, according to these remote viewing data, is that at least with one of the jets, we have a very good description of what is called uninterruptible autopilot. Now, that's a system that was actually patented in December of 2006, but the companies don't patent their stuff until they want the technology to be public, meaning once you patent something, you're leaking it out what you actually did. So it was available for military applications a great many years before that. But starting in from December 2006 on, it was available for commercial applications in the sense that anybody could install it in their jets. Now there are a large number of jets now that have the uninterruptible autopilot installed in their commercial jets that have been installed in their, by the airline companies. But before that, in 2001, it was strictly a military thing. So, but what we have with the remote viewing is a very clear description of an uninterruptible autopilot system taking over, where you have the pilot at the controls and nothing works. No amount of strength can move the yoke. He could not control the plane. And it controls everything, including the radios. So nothing comes out of the plane, nothing goes in. I mean, it controls absolutely everything. And somebody else was flying those planes, somebody that wasn't on the plane. So that's what the remote viewing data say. And to watch that session done by Dick Allgaier is absolutely fascinating, because he's looking at that and he's saying, this is weird. They can't even control the plane. Look at that. They can't, none of the controls. They're flipping switches. They can't, no matter how strong they are, they can't move this yoke. And to my knowledge, Dick Allgaier had never even heard of uninterruptible autopilot when he did the session. So but it was such a clear example of a clear description of the uninterruptible autopilot process. I mean, it's absolutely unambiguous. So, and it's fascinating that all the detail that comes out in these sessions is just amazing. I mean, it's really, those 4 hours is way better than anything on TV.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2. If you enjoyed the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.